Today, geographers have been concerned with the digital for some time. Interestingly, from fairly early on, what you get is an interest in telecommunications infrastructure as a peculiarly urban issue. So it's not addressed as telecommunications infrastructure, it's addressed as there's this stuff that's happening in cities that we ought to be interested in. The cities are the thing that takes precedence, and so these issues arise because things are being transformed within cities. It's not that people got interested in the digital and then thought, oh, is this happening in cities? It's that there's been a long-standing interest in the urban, and as a result, when these sorts of technologies started to become much more evident, geographers started paying attention to in what ways and beginning to ask questions. So you get the likes of Ashermin and Nigel Thrift in their book on cities talking about software and the ways in which urban practices are becoming mediated by code. And then, on the other hand, the subtext to that is that Ammon and Thrift are broadly being critical or normatively negative about. Mike Batty and the people in the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis at UCL, who are really interested in this stuff because they're spatial modelers and they're interested in how their techniques might be applied to city governance, are a bit more positive, and they remain so. There's an interesting diversity of opinions about what software coming into the fabric of the city means, what it can do, and the kinds of questions that geographers might ask about it. There is then a popular science or popular culture version of this discourse, and Adam Greenfield wrote a book way back in it came out in 2006 called Everywhere, where he more or less argues about lots of different cuts through the ways in which the confluence of social media, these things that are being referred to as the Internet of Things now, but were called things like pervasive computing or ubiquitous computing 15 years ago, makes certain kinds of companies are making certain kinds of claims about what those things are going to do, what sorts of services they're going to facilitate, and what kind of a world will be brought into existence. And so you get these sorts of claims about the world. Distributed and forever storage. We now just call that the cloud. All sorts of forms of sophisticated data analytics, and we talk about algorithms colloquially now. That's the kind of code word that stands in for that stuff. And then we talk about software-enabled automated management of things. And in part, that's the Internet of Things. In part, that's all sorts of ways in which we talk about forms of automation, or we call them by a brand name. So you could argue that Uber is a software-enabled automated management of, as the Americans call it, ride-hailing, calling a taxi and paying for it. And all of these things collectively, all sorts of different stripes that you might take through this, variously constitute this slightly opaque term, the smart city. And geographers have been concerned with smart cities since they became a big deal in marketing rhetoric for all sorts of different kinds of people. Developers, IBM, sell their smarter planet idea to regional and city governments in the form of their sort of AI system that they call WATS. And then there's all sorts of other companies. But there's also a sense in which actually smart city technologies, if we put aside our cynicism, actually have some kind of meaning, have some kind of benefit to certain kinds of people, and they achieve certain kinds of things in the world. More often than not, though, it's about instrumentation, and it's about instrumentation to particular kinds of ends. So you can think about ANPR, automatic number plate recognition, and the ways in which the congestion charge functions, the ways in which all sorts of forms of access or penalty are issued. So we talk about smart motorways. That would be a kind of a allied technology to this stuff. Increasingly, there are ways in which quasi-automated systems facilitate certain kinds of things happening in the fabric of the city. You might have a dynamically changing lane management system whereby a road just has a series of lanes across it, and there's gantries over the top of the road, and there's either a green or a red light above the lane in your direction, so you know you can come into that lane. And what that does is manages volume of traffic in rush hour, so they can open up more lanes for the direction that has the greatest level of traffic. So as I understand it, that's not a fully automated system. There are people who are monitoring that, but there is a sense in which the instrumentation facilitates particular kinds of things being possible. The other examples I've got here, and I'll mention them briefly, is SF Park, which is the parking meter. These are smart parking meters that use surge pricing, just like Uber does. So when the demand goes up, the price goes up, and there's an app that goes with it, so you can see where there's available parking and it's cheaper, and where the price has gone up because there's a lot of demand for it. So it's paired with a sensor in the fabric of the road, so it knows when a car is parked, and that can trigger certain kinds of things happening in terms of pricing structure. The sign and the ambiguous box on a red brick wall that you can see are here in Exeter, and they're just outside Princess Hay, one of the ways in, and the sign explains what it is. Essentially, you are being surveilled in Princess Hay by a system that passively locates you using your mobile phone. As soon as you walk in, it can send out these signals, triangulate your location as you move through the shopping centre, and it knows particular individuals as they go. But all of these things go to show the various ways in which software is instrumenting certain kinds of things, making certain kinds of things possible. Some we might consider to be desirable, some we might not. That is more or less what Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodge would call a coded space. So software is diffuse in the environment and it conditions forms of spatial experience. So a coded space. So it's spaces that are penetrated by information technologies, but they're not necessarily reliant upon them. So why have I got a weird pseudo-digitized picture of a bagel? Well, I'll give you an anecdote. I was in America at a conference and a friend of mine wanted to get a coffee and a snack. And so we went into a well-known chain and up to the counter, made the order. He presents a loyalty card and we go in queue. We haven't said a name like you would do in some places. We just go and stand in queue. And a few people go in front of us. And then all of a sudden they say, Matt. And my friend says, yeah, that's me. But they knew his name. Well, how did they know his name? Well, they knew his name because the loyalty card obviously brought that stuff up on the system that enabled them to write it on the paper cut or the order and pass it down the line. So there's a sense in which the database linking the card to the shop to the order facilitates a particular kind of quite banal thing happening, but nevertheless it wouldn't happen without software. It doesn't mean that that cafe doesn't work, right? It just slightly alters how the cafe works. However, there are certain kinds of spaces in the world now, as Kitchen and Dodge argue, that simply will not function without their instrumentation and their software. And the canonical example is the airport terminal building. Pretty much everything in that building requires the networked infrastructure and requires software to function. From checking in, to dropping your baggage, to getting through certain forms of security and passport control, to finding your way to your gate, to the plane appearing, all of it requires information communications technologies to be working and to be working together in sync in quite a fast pace, and the tolerances are minuscule. Any one of those things fails, it can cause a significant problem. If a lot of those things fail, you're just standing in a big shed. It ceases to have any functionality. It's just a big cavernous building with windows and doors. So when software becomes absolutely instrumental to how a certain kind of space functions, and it simply doesn't function without it, we can call those code spaces, following Dodge and Kitchen. And that's different from a smart city, because a smart city will have different versions of coded spaces and code space, and there'll be different kinds of mixings of how that functions, and it won't be evenly distributed across time and space. Nevertheless, the smart city is big business, and I want to show you a fairly old advert now, but this is an advert for IBM that kind of illustrates the sorts of claims that are being made about the technologies that I've just been talking about.
The time to make our city smarter is now. But how do you keep traffic flowing? Cure a healthcare system. Protect citizens while protecting their privacy. How do you show one decision affecting millions of people? Become a citizen of the smarter city.
So IBM have quite effectively branded this, and they sell it as either a turnkey solution, an off-the-shelf solution where IBM people will come to your city, they'll install the various stuff. Watson gets fired up as this kind of big AI system in the background, and it will run certain kinds of things in the IBM way for your city. So Rio de Janeiro, for instance, has that technology sitting behind it for certain aspects of how it functions and how it's governed. You can pay a bit more and it can become bespoke, but it's a service that's being sold in much the same way as we buy Dropbox or another on-demand service that sits in the background and facilitates certain kinds of things happening for us in our lives. So this is for the whole city. This is contingent upon a lot of data, both being captured and being generated, being processed, and then things happening as a result. So what does that look like? Well, let's return to Princess Hay, and here's the advertising video for the system that I said exists there. Who or what is the product of a data-driven market? is a question that becomes fairly pertinent, because an awful lot of these systems and an awful lot of the systems that then underlie what we call a smart city, or what we might refer to as coded spaces or code space, we are increasingly in an ambiguous position as citizens moving around in those spaces. We're not the sovereign client and the person who is definitively benefiting from all these things. More often than not, we're part of the product. We are being measured and tracked, and on that basis we might be aggregated as a type, and that data is being used to serve as advertising, or at least to change how certain kinds of things work in the world that we inhabit. But it doesn't really matter if you opt in or not, because even if you don't opt in, even if you don't have any social media or you only have a basic mobile phone, there are still ways in which you are being measured and monitored. And so we're sort of constantly, knowingly or not, in a form of trade-off, that we have nice new shopping centres like Princess Hay. They're built on the back of certain kinds of rationale for how apparently public spaces can and should function. Because of course Princess Hay is not a public space, it's a privately operated public space. It's actually owned by a company, but it's open, so it looks like it's a kind of a public. And that's a common theme across the United Kingdom. Most city centre shopping districts that have been redeveloped follow this path. Not all of them are instrumented to the same degree. That's dependent upon the demographic. So on the back of all those things that I've just been talking about, we might, and I don't have a clear answer to this question, but we might ask ourselves as geographers to what extent data then represent or enact a world. Perhaps it's a bit of both. But some key things that we might begin to observe and might begin to ask questions about arise on the basis of these technologies. Because more often than not, data are presented as somehow neutral. They're aligned with the kinds of data we might collect about rainfall or other forms of apparently natural measurements. Because after all, we can see a sort of common sense behind the claim that sensors or algorithms, they don't have any politics or a political agenda. They reflect and produce what they measure. And what that facilitates is a kind of benign common sense story for smart cities. However, as many geographers and all sorts of social scientists and scholars in the humanities have pointed out, and if you're particularly interested in this, I really wholeheartedly recommend you check out a group called Data and Society in New York, who've done some fabulous work about these sorts of issues. One of the principal arguments then is data are never neutral. Never. They cannot exist independently of the ideas, the techniques, the technologies, the people and the context that conceive, produce, process, manage, analyse and store them. In that sense, as Rob Kitchen and many others have observed, raw data, in the context I'm talking about here, is an oxymoron. It's never raw. If you're talking about data, there are always inherently built-in assumptions about what that data is supposed to represent.